In the sprawling suburbs of Long Island, a place known more for its quiet streets and coastal charm, a different kind of power was taking root. It was a power built not on wealth or influence in the traditional sense, but on fear, violence, and unwavering loyalty to a blood-red flag. At the center of this dark empire was a man named Howard Davis. To the law he was a menace, to his rivals a nightmare, but to his followers in the notorious Blood Street Gang, he was a leader. They called him Mousey. It was a nickname that seemed almost comically mismatched with the sheer brutality he was known to command. A mouse is small, timid. Howard Davis was anything but. His story is not one of a sudden fall from grace, but a slow, calculated ascent to the top of a violent hierarchy. Born and raised in Bellport, Long Island, Davis navigated a world far removed from the idyllic image of the Hamptons. He found his identity and his purpose within the rigid, violent structure of the Bloods. He wasn't just a member, he was a natural leader, charismatic to his allies and ruthless to his enemies. His ambition was clear: to control his territory, to eliminate his rivals, and to build a criminal enterprise that would be both feared and respected in the underworld. His reputation grew with every act of defiance, every display of force. By his mid-30s, Davis was not just a soldier in the gang wars, he was a general. He had carved out his own fiefdom, a particularly violent faction of the Bloods known as the S Side, or more chillingly, Slut Rippin'. The name itself was a declaration of dominance and disrespect to rivals. Under his command, this group would become one of the most feared criminal organizations in Suffolk County. Davis was the architect of their strategy, the one who gave the orders, and sometimes, the one who pulled the trigger. His leadership was absolute, his authority unquestioned, and the consequences for disloyalty were swift and severe. This was a man who operated with a chilling sense of impunity. He saw the law not as a barrier, but as a temporary inconvenience, an opponent in a long and bloody game. His influence extended from the streets of Bellport to the very walls of the prisons meant to contain him. He was known as Mousey, but also by another, perhaps more fitting moniker, Mr. Fed Up. It was a name that hinted at a deep-seated aggression, a man fed up with rivals, fed up with the authorities, and ready to answer any challenge with overwhelming force. His rise to power was a story written in blood, and for years it seemed his reign would never end. Between the years 2016 and 2021, a dark shadow fell over parts of Suffolk County. It was a period defined by a surge in violence that felt personal, targeted, and relentlessly cruel. This was the era of Howard Mousey Davis's undisputed leadership. His criminal enterprise wasn't hidden in the shadows. It operated in plain sight, terrorizing communities with a campaign of shootings, home invasions, and brazen drug trafficking. The message was clear: this was his territory, and the rules were his to make. The violence wasn't random, it was a tool, a method of control, a way to enforce his will and expand his empire one brutal act at a time. Davis's influence was pervasive. He didn't just participate in the gang's activities, he orchestrated them with the precision of a military commander. He maintained what prosecutors would later describe as a standing order for his underlings. If they saw certain rivals, they were to kill them on sight. There was no need for further discussion, no need to call for permission. The order was absolute. This directive turned the streets into a constant war zone, where a chance encounter at a gas station or a grocery store could erupt into deadly violence. Fear became a daily reality for those who lived in the crosshairs of his many feuds. The targets of his wrath were numerous. Rival gang members were the primary focus, but anyone perceived as a threat or an obstacle was at risk. The violence was not confined to street corners, it spilled into homes and businesses. Davis orchestrated armed home invasions, sending his crews to smash through doors and terrorize families in their own sanctuaries. He directed armed robberies, turning everyday encounters into life-or-death situations. In one instance, he personally assaulted a man at a bar, a savage attack that left the victim with a broken kneecap and a shattered nose. Each act was a demonstration of power, a reminder of who was in charge. The terror was not just physical, it was psychological. The community lived under the weight of this constant threat, knowing that a powerful and merciless figure was pulling the strings. The flow of dangerous narcotics like fentanyl, crack cocaine, and heroin into the neighborhoods was a direct result of his trafficking operation, which poisoned the very communities he claimed to rule. For 5 years, Howard Davis's name was synonymous with fear on Long Island. He was the ghost in the machine of organized crime, a leader whose reign left a trail of victims, shattered lives, and a community desperate for an end to the violence. The S Side or slut-rippin' faction of the Bloods was more than just a street gang. Under Howard Davis, it evolved into a sophisticated criminal syndicate. Davis was its CEO, and violence was its primary business model. He understood that to maintain power and profit, he needed to project an image of absolute and terrifying strength. He actively recruited other Bloods members into his fold, not just for their numbers, but for their willingness to perpetuate the same level of brutality that he himself embodied. Loyalty was demanded, and it was tested through acts of violence that served to both intimidate rivals and bind the gang members closer together through shared criminality. The gang's operations were multifaceted. The most lucrative arm of the enterprise was drug trafficking. Davis oversaw a large-scale distribution network that pumped massive quantities of crack cocaine, fentanyl, and marijuana throughout Suffolk County. This wasn't a low-level street corner operation, it was a coordinated effort to control the local drug trade. The profits from this business funded the gang's lifestyle and, more importantly, armed them for the violent enforcement needed to protect their turf. The drugs fueled addiction and despair in the community, while the money fueled Davis's ever-growing power and influence. Violence was the engine that drove the entire operation. It was used to eliminate competition from rival drug dealers, to punish those who owed the gang money, and to silence anyone who might consider cooperating with law enforcement. Davis directed his crew to carry out shootings with chilling regularity. These were not just warnings, they were assassination attempts. He would handpick the shooters, provide the firearms, and identify the targets. His orders were explicit and left no room for interpretation. The goal was to inflict maximum damage, to send a message that was impossible to ignore. Crossing the S Side syndicate was a fatal mistake. This blend of organized drug distribution and strategic violence made the S Side faction exceptionally dangerous. It operated less like a group of disorganized thugs and more like a paramilitary force with a clear chain of command, all leading back to one man. Davis's leadership was characterized by this cold, business-like approach to crime. Every shooting, every robbery, every drug deal was a calculated move in a larger game. He was building an empire founded on fear, and for a time, business was booming. The cost, however, was measured in the blood and suffering of his victims and the slow decay of the community he held in his grip. The case against Howard Davis was built upon a staggering list of violent acts he either personally committed or ordered others to carry out. From June 2016 to November 2017 alone, his direct involvement in bloodshed was prolific. Prosecutors detailed how Davis personally participated in 3 separate shootings, which resulted in 3 different victims being struck by gunfire. These were not stray bullets or warning shots. They were deliberate attempts on human lives. One of the victims was so severely injured that they were left in a coma for an extended period, a living testament to the savagery of the attack. Davis was not a distant leader. He was a hands-on enforcer of his own brutal code. Beyond the violence he committed himself, he was the architect of much more. During that same period, he ordered 2 additional shootings that wounded 2 more people. One of the most chilling examples of his command came on October 19, 2021. From a position of authority, he directed 2 lower-ranking Bloods members to hunt down and execute a rival gang member. The shooters followed their orders, locating the target and opening fire. The victim was struck multiple times but miraculously survived the assassination attempt. This incident would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a clear-cut example of Davis using his power to order a murder. His murderous plots were not limited to that single attempt. The trial revealed that during the summer of 2021, Davis was actively conspiring to murder two other individuals, identified in court documents only as John Doe 1 and John Doe 2. These were not crimes of passion but calculated, premeditated conspiracies to eliminate his enemies. This pattern of behavior demonstrated a complete disregard for human life and a belief that he could act as judge, jury, and executioner on the streets of Long Island. The violence was constant, methodical, and directly traceable back to his commands. Even while incarcerated and awaiting trial, his capacity for violence did not diminish. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, he was a force of chaos, racking up 9 separate disciplinary violations. These were not minor infractions. The violations included multiple assaults on other inmates, culminating in a particularly vicious attack where he slashed another inmate's face. This behavior was crucial for prosecutors, as it showed that his violent nature was not situational. It was an intrinsic part of who he was, whether he was on the streets of Bellport or behind the locked doors of a federal prison. The beginning of the end for Howard Mousey Davis came not with a single dramatic arrest, but with the slow, meticulous work of federal investigators. For years, law enforcement had been building a case, connecting the dots between the street-level violence and the man at the top.
When the federal indictment finally came down, it was sweeping. Davis was charged with an astonishing 48 federal counts.
The charges read like a catalog of a modern crime lord's career: racketeering, murder conspiracy, attempted murder, assault, robbery, obstruction of justice, and narcotics trafficking. The government was not just aiming to convict him of a single crime, it was aiming to dismantle his entire criminal enterprise.
The trial, which began in the federal courthouse in Central Islip, was set to be a titanic legal battle. It spanned 6 weeks and promised to pull back the curtain on the inner workings of the East Side Bloods.
The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, prepared to present a mountain of evidence. Our strategy was clear: to prove that Howard Davis was the undisputed leader of this violent racketeering organization and that he was directly responsible for the reign of terror that had plagued Suffolk County. We intended to use his own words, his own actions, and the testimony of those who once followed him to seal his fate.
The defense, on the other hand, faced an uphill battle. They sought to portray the government's witnesses as unreliable, as criminals and liars who were only testifying to save themselves. They would argue that Davis was being scapegoated, that the violence attributed to him was the work of others acting on their own accord. The core of their challenge was to create reasonable doubt, to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative, and to convince the jury that the man they saw in the courtroom was not the monster the government made him out to be.
The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between two competing versions of reality.
As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a theater of Long Island's underworld. The jury heard harrowing accounts of shootings and home invasions. They were shown evidence of a sprawling drug network. And most importantly, they began to hear from the people who knew Davis's operation from the inside.
The federal prosecutors were confident. We believed the evidence was overwhelming and that the combination of witness testimony, recorded calls, and physical evidence would paint a picture so clear and so damning that the jury would have no choice but to find him guilty on all counts.
The walls, which had seemed so distant for so long, were finally closing in on Mousey Davis. The most powerful weapon in the prosecution's arsenal was, honestly, the testimony of those who had once sworn loyalty to Howard Davis. Several former members of his own East Side crew, facing their own lengthy prison sentences, chose to cooperate with the government. They took the witness stand, one by one, to testify against their former leader. For the jury, this was a rare and chilling glimpse into the secret world of a violent street gang. These men, whose names were mostly kept from the public record to protect them, provided first-hand accounts of the crimes they had committed under Davis's direct orders, creating a direct line from the violence on the street to the man sitting at the defense table. Their testimony was devastatingly specific.
The gang had a strict structure, and Davis was always at the top. He called the shots. We had meetings where he'd tell us who needed to get hit, who was a problem. Sometimes he'd just say, "If you see this person do it, don't hesitate."
Yeah, it wasn't like you had a choice. There was a standing order. If you saw certain people, you had to kill them. That wasn't a suggestion, that was a command. He gave us guns, told us what to do, and we reported back after.
Their stories corroborated each other, weaving a consistent and damning narrative of a leader who ruled through fear and intimidation. The former gang members spoke about the drug trafficking operation in painstaking detail.
Davis told us what to sell: crack, fentanyl, whatever. We had to give him the money. Everything went up the chain. If you didn't pay, you got hurt, or worse.
He ran it like a business. He decided who worked where, who could sell, who couldn't, and if you crossed him, you paid for it.
This testimony was crucial in establishing the racketeering charge, proving that the S-Side Bloods were not just a violent gang, but a criminal enterprise focused on generating illegal income. They laid out the hierarchy, the turf, and the brutal methods used to enforce their control over the local drug market. It was the testimony of insiders, and it stripped away any plausible deniability Davis might have hoped to claim. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of their testimony was the fear they still clearly held for their former boss.
I'm scared even now talking about this. Davis, he could snap. If he thought you were a snitch, you were as good as dead. I know what I'm risking by being here.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's the truth. He ran everything through fear. We're not just telling stories, we're admitting what we did and who told us to do it.
They were not just telling stories, they were confessing to their own roles in a reign of terror, all while pointing to the man they said was the architect of it all. While the testimony of cooperating witnesses was powerful, it was the hard, irrefutable evidence that hammered the final nails into Howard Davis's coffin. The prosecution presented a trove of recorded jail calls that captured Davis continuing his criminal enterprise from behind bars.
In one of the most damaging recordings, the jury heard Davis on the phone, issuing a chilling order to a subordinate on the outside. He told the guy to find and violently assault someone he thought was cooperating with law enforcement. The order was carried out. The victim ended up with a broken jaw. That's witness tampering, plain and simple, and it was orchestrated from a jail cell.
The evidence of his misconduct in custody didn't stop there. An even more shocking revelation emerged about how he smuggled contraband into prison.
On Christmas Day in 2018, while Davis was at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, he conspired with the mother of his child to sneak drugs in, using their own infant. The plan was to hide the drugs on the baby, hoping to get them past security. It was just unbelievable. The jury was horrified.
Further evidence exposed his efforts to obstruct justice even before his major indictment.
Back in 2016, Davis convinced the mother of his child to lie to a federal grand jury. Her false testimony got a firearms charge dismissed. That showed a pattern. He knew how to manipulate the system and the people around him.
Combined, this evidence painted an undeniable picture of a man who was incorrigible and uncontainable. The jail calls were his own voice, condemning him with his own commands. The drug smuggling plot revealed a shocking lack of morality, and the history of obstruction showed a long-standing contempt for the very legal system he now faced. This was not just testimony from criminals who might have a motive to lie, this was objective, damning proof. The jury was left with little room for doubt about the character and criminality of Howard Mousey Davis. He was not just a leader, he was an active, hands-on criminal, even when locked away. After a 6-week trial and a mountain of evidence, the jury delivered its verdict. In July 2023, they found Howard Mousey Davis guilty. It was a clean sweep for the prosecution.
He was convicted on all 29 counts against him, including racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, assault with a dangerous weapon, witness tampering, and a host of narcotics and firearms offenses. The verdict was a decisive rejection of the defense's arguments and a full-throated validation of the government's case.
For the prosecutors and the investigators who had spent years on the case, it was a moment of profound victory. For Davis, it was the end of the line. The final chapter of his story was written on July 9, 2024, in the federal courthouse in Central Islip. U.S. District Judge Joan M. Azraq handed down the sentence, and it was designed to ensure that Howard Davis would never again walk the streets as a free man.
He was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional consecutive 132 years. The sentence reflected the severity and breadth of his crimes, a life sentence for the reign of terror he led, and additional decades for the specific acts of violence, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice he committed along the way. It was one of the stiffest sentences possible under federal law.
In a statement following the sentencing, U.S. Attorney Brian Peace captured the gravity of the moment.
Davis and his violent gang tormented our Long Island neighborhoods for years. Today's sentence ends his reign of terror. Peace described Davis as a merciless leader who left a trail of victims in his wake, including a victim in a coma and another with a broken jaw for allegedly cooperating with law enforcement. He emphasized that the sentence sent a clear message that the Department of Justice would work tirelessly to dismantle violent gangs and hold their leaders accountable for the destruction they cause.
The sentence was not just a punishment, it was a declaration. It affirmed that no one is above the law, no matter how feared or powerful they may be in the criminal underworld. The life plus 132-year term ensured that Davis's influence, which he had managed to exert even from behind bars, was finally and permanently neutralized. The man who had orchestrated years of violence, who had ordered murders and smuggled drugs using an infant, and who had believed he could outsmart the justice system, would now spend every remaining day of his life in a federal prison. Judgment Day had arrived, and it was absolute. The conviction and sentencing of Howard Mousey Davis marked more than just the end of a high-profile trial. It signified a turning point for the Long Island communities that had lived under the shadow of his violence for so long. For years, the East Side Bloods had operated with a sense of impunity, and Davis was the untouchable figure at the helm. His permanent removal from society was a monumental victory for law enforcement, and more importantly, a profound relief for the residents of Bellport and surrounding neighborhoods. It was a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been building for half a decade. Ivan J. Arvello, the special agent in charge for Homeland Security Investigations New York, noted the broader impact of Davis's leadership style. He pointed out that Davis actively recruited other Bloods members to perpetuate the same brutality he himself engaged in for years. His removal was not just about taking one violent person off the streets, it was about decapitating a criminal organization and disrupting the cycle of recruitment and violence he had fostered. The life sentence served as a powerful deterrent, sending a clear signal to other gang members that a life of crime under such a leader leads to only one destination: a federal prison cell. With Davis gone, the community could begin the slow process of healing. The constant threat of gang warfare, the open-air drug markets, and the fear of stray bullets had eroded the sense of safety and security that every neighborhood deserves. While the problems of crime and drugs would not vanish overnight, the removal of such a dominant and violent leader created a vacuum that offered an opportunity for positive change. Community leaders, law enforcement, and residents could now work to reclaim their streets without the oppressive influence of Davis and his syndicate looming over them. The sentence represented a chance to rebuild trust and restore peace. Ultimately, the downfall of Howard Mousey Davis is a stark cautionary tale. It's a story of how a man's quest for power through violence inevitably leads to self-destruction. He built an empire of fear, but that same empire created the witnesses and the evidence that would bring him down. His legacy is not one of power or respect, but of shattered lives, grieving families, and a community scarred by his actions. The life plus 132-year sentence ensures that his story will end not on the streets he once ruled, but in the silent anonymity of a prison, a final, quiet testament to the fact that, in the end, justice prevails. If you want to know more about the true stories behind New York's most notorious gangs, hit that subscribe button, because in the world of true crime, the truth is never simple, and it's never safe.